Okay, we're still looking at anti-imperialist movements and the dissolution of empires. Letter C states that transnational movements sought to unite people across national boundaries. Some of the transnational movements we need to look at are communism, pan-Arabism, and pan-Africanism. Transnational communist movements developed during the Cold War. Examples of this is the Warsaw Pact, which was the alliance created as a result of NATO. Then you have the USSR sending money into North Korea, China, Vietnam, and Cuba. There's also socialist and communist support in Latin America. For example, Che in Cuba. There's a great documentary of Che on Netflix. It was a mini-series. There's two 2-hour videos there. And then Allende movement and the anti-American movements down in Latin America as well. Of course, Cuba is going to support Ethiopia, which we talked about in another lecture. And then the USSR controlled the Eastern Bloc. Examples of that are Prague Spring and the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Pan-African movement was actually super organized. There were 7 meetings between 1900 and 1994 of the Pan-African Conference. The first was organized by the American W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm sure you've actually heard of him. The goal of the Pan-African conferences was to end colonization and promote the decolonization. It also included the promotion of human rights throughout all of Africa and equal economic opportunities for the African states. Another example of Pan-African movement can be found in the All-African Peoples Conference. Again, it was part of the decolonization process of Africa, and they had 3 conferences throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Pan-Arab movement was really started in 1945 as a result of the ending of the mandate system. The goal was to, this is the official statement of their documentation, draw closer the relations between member states and coordinate collaboration between them to safeguard their independence and sovereignty, and to consider in a general way the affairs and interests of the Arab countries. Now, we saw the Pan-Arab movement when we looked at Israel. The creation of Israel was one of the leading Pan-Arab movements when they were fighting against the creation of Israel. These are the states that are part of the Pan-Arab movement, or the Arab League. Currently, Syria is not allowed to be part of the Arab League as a result of the current revolutions taking place there. There are several conflicts associated with Pan-Arab movements. First, I'm going to talk about Egypt. Egypt was a British colony with its own king, an Egyptian king that became independent in the 1930s. In 1954, the British agreed to pull troops out of the Suez Canal. President Nasser then nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. What that means is that the government of Egypt would control the profits associated with the use of the Suez Canal. This created a war in 1956. Great Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt, but the U.S. and the Soviets said that this war did not need to happen. The idea was that the Suez Canal, the profits of the Suez Canal were going to be really important to Egypt's economy. And we didn't necessarily, the British and the French felt that the nationalization would rise the prices of the use of the Suez Canal. Basically, what this does is it shows that there were tensions between the British with the U.S. and that notice that I did not say that Israel pulled out of this war. Israel is actually going to continue to fight Egypt and going to do very well in that war against Egypt. The president of Egypt, Sadat, was assassinated in 1981, possibly by a PLO member, PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Basically, Egypt was negotiating with the United States, and we were really influencing what Egypt was doing. And the Arab League and most of the Arab states did not like what Egypt was doing, so they assassinated the president. Obviously, the largest pan-Arab conflict has to deal with Israel. In 1964, the Arab League created the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, with Yasser Arafat as the leader. The goal was to protect Palestinian lands from the emerging Israeli state. It's not very successful and often used terrorist methods in order to get their point across. We will have a war in 1967. Israel is successful against Egypt and Syria and gains land. There's another war in 1973. Israel defeats the Arab League again. And eventually, the United States will step in, and we will help Egypt and Israel negotiate. The Arab nations didn't like this, and that's when Sadat's going to get assassinated. In 1993, we went as far to bring in Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, and the Prime Minister of Israel to negotiate. What ended up happening was the Oslo Agreement. It stated that Palestine would self-govern the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for 5 years. Rabin was assassinated in 1995, probably from the PLO. So this negotiation that we brokered through President Clinton ends up not working. Iran was another pan-Arab issue. The CIA was negotiating to keep a man, Pahlavi, in power, and we were basically funding him and making sure that he remained in control. The goal was to keep Iran anti-communist. In 1979, there was a Shiite fundamentalist revolution that was happening, and Pahlavi ran away. He ended up in the United States. Ayatollah Khomeini takes over, and as a result of the revolution, captures American hostages in the capital, Tehran. Iran closed down all U.S. military bases and confiscated all U.S.-owned companies. To this day, there is still not any U.S. presence in Iran. Today, Iran is a fundamentalist Shiite theocracy with using Sharia law as its base of government. We're also very fearful of Iran getting a hold of nuclear weapons. Another pan-Arab conflict is dealing with Iraq and Saddam Hussein. We have been dealing with Saddam Hussein since 1980. Hussein attacked Iran in the middle of the revolution, and basically we end up selling guns to Iran to protect Iran. This is immediately after the hostage situation. No one wins because they're pretty much equally matched, and 1 million people die, and the borders stay the same between Iraq and Iran. Saddam Hussein shows up again 10 years later when he invaded Kuwait. This is the Persian Gulf War, where the United States went in 1991 and pushed Iraq out of Kuwait. There was a possible opportunity to capture Saddam Hussein during this war, but it didn't happen. In 2001, the United States said that Saddam Hussein was developing what President George W. Bush called weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction do not just mean nuclear bombs. Most of the new weapons of mass destruction are really about biochemical warfare, vials of smallpox that could be released into a population. The UN went in and searched and didn't find anything. In 2003, we invaded Iraq because of the WMD issue. The UN and most of our NATO allies said that we had no business being there. What we found was death camps. We didn't find any WMDs, but we did find that Saddam Hussein had been attacking Shiite and other religious groups throughout Iraq and had been killing them in a very Hitler way. He was removed from office in April of 2003, and we captured him in December. We found him in a hole dug in the ground where he was hiding. I find that quite humorous. And we handed him over to Iraq's courts so that Iraq could try him for crimes against the people. There's reasons for this. One of the reasons was that we wanted him dead. The international court will never be able to use the death penalty. The death penalty is something that is so controversial throughout the world that it's not something that the UN is willing to use. So one of the reasons why we turned Saddam Hussein over to his own people is so that he could be killed by his own people. He was convicted of killing 148 Shiites in 1982 and was sentenced to death. He was hanged. You can actually probably find the video on YouTube. I don't suggest you look at it. But most of what he was saying before his death was about American imperialists and how awful the United States is and what an innocent person he was. Within states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, movements promoted communism and socialism as a way to redistribute land and resources. If you remember, China had the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and Chiang Kai-shek decides to hide out in Taiwan. And the People's Republic of China was officially created on October 1st, 1949. In 1958, Mao Zedong created what was called the Great Leap Forward, which was really a really huge leap backwards. The goal was to modernize China. The population was organized into communes, and those populations were supposed to both industrialize and provide for their agricultural needs. What ends up happening is massive famine, and the plan was completely abandoned. About 20 million people died of starvation and malnutrition as a result of the Great Leap Forward. Instead, he decided that peasants could farm and sell at market. He allowed for more open speech, and this is going to cause problems for Mao. A bunch of people just died, and then he allowed people to speak out in public. Not going to be good. This is propaganda associated with the Great Leap Forward. You can see that the breadbasket is full of goods. There's a battleship in there. There's a plane. There's industry. Of course, there's fireworks because the Chinese founded gunpowder. And then you can see there's farmers, military people. Everybody in society was represented. And as everyone worked together, then China would succeed. Obviously, it doesn't work. The international standard for a man who is working a hard 8-hour day, like in industry or in farming, is in between 3,000 and 4,000 calories. Here you can see the results of the Great Leap Forward. The average calorie intake continued to be decreased, which is why so many people died. In 1966, Mao Zedong reversed all of his open speech policies and created what was called the Cultural Revolution. The army was used as politics. Mao published his Little Red Book, which I have a copy of in the classroom if you want to take a look at it. Everyone had to carry the Little Red Book. It was basically just sayings and writings of Mao Zedong. It became their Bible. So everybody would carry the Little Red Book around and read it constantly. Mao's wife, Lady Mao, becomes very influential as a result of this. She worked in culture, arts, and with children. The Red Guard was created, which was 10 million 9 to 18-year-old, including women, and their goal was to travel around the state to promote Maoism, distribute Little Red Books, and teach everybody. The Red Guard started to become violent, and they started attacking people who were against communism. The Red Guard had to be disbanded because they became so violent, and schools and universities had to close because there was so much controversy and tension in the state. The army gains more power and influence, and Mao Zedong actually did kill a lot of people associated with the Cultural Revolution. People would disappear quite often. If you were an intellectual in any way, shape, or form, you either went into service to the state or you were murdered as a result of your Republican ideas or thinking anything against communism. Groups started to form against Mao, of course, quietly. There were two groups fighting for power as Mao Zedong started to lose power. One was called the Gang of Four. You can see them listed at the bottom. And yes, that is Mao Zedong's wife. They were militant, and they felt that radical communism needed to be reintroduced, and they needed to go back towards the Cultural Revolution and continue to kill people not associated with the revolution. Deng Xiaoping was a leader who actually was educated in Europe, and he wanted a little bit of capitalism in with the communist ideology. Mao Zedong died in 1976 of Parkinson's disease. Mao's wife changed his writing to make it seem like she was supposed to be in charge. She and the rest of the Gang of Four were arrested as a result of her lying about Mao's wishes after his death. She lived to be 77 and actually eventually committed suicide. However, if you do travel to China and you are ever in Beijing, you can still go see Mao Zedong's body that is on display in the same case that is pictured here at his funeral. Deng Xiaoping is a very unique character in China's history. He had been on the Long March and had obviously spent a lot of time with Mao Zedong. However, he did spend some time studying in France. As a result, he's more of a socialist than he is a communist. When he was exiled as a result of being a little bit more towards center than the radical left that the communists want, because he wanted to introduce capitalism. He was rehabilitated by the communists by working in work camps. When Deng Xiaoping officially came into power, he issued 4 modernizations. One of the focuses was agriculture. 80% of the Chinese lived in the countryside. That's still the case today. And what he wanted to do was introduce mechanized farming and a little bit of the Green Revolution. He wanted to increase food production 4 to 5% each year over a 10-year period. He also wanted to fix water supplies and introduce chemicals into farming. What he did was he created the household responsibility system. Everyone was given plots to use, and your job is to grow as much food on that plot as possible. You were given a quota according to your commune or your village, and you had to meet that quota for the government. Any surplus could be sold for profit. This system still exists. Many successful farmers actually do make profit off of some of the surplus that they produce. The second thing that Mao wanted to focus on was industrialization. Iron, coal, steel, and oil are going to be emphasized in their industrialization process, and the government invests tons and tons and tons of money into this process. They build new mines, new mills, new power stations. There were two phases. In phase one, he creates the industrial responsibility system. So there was a quota for each and every company, and once they filled that quota to the state, the company could keep the profits. Quality control was also established during phase one. Phase two, which is still going on, kept public ownership and lessened government control. Small and medium enterprises were given over to managers to increase production. And of course, recently, they started to introduce the importation of American factories. Another area that was part of the four modernizations was science and technology. China was really behind because of the Cultural Revolution. Remember, Mao Zedong killed most of the smart people. And so they didn't have any professionals they needed. They didn't have doctors, they didn't have scientists, they didn't have anything like that. So they wanted to compete with the levels of other countries. They wanted to increase the number of professionals to 800,000 people. What they did was they created research systems and university systems to try to increase their involvement in science and technology. While this still is not as successful as what we saw in Japan, they are making movements in this regards. Something else that Deng Xiaoping wanted to focus on was military. There was a war between China and Vietnam in 1979 over borders. China wins, but they saw some serious issues in their military. They had a 4 million man army, which is the largest in the world, but they didn't have any weapons. They tried to create nuclear bombs in the 60s, but they had stopped research, so they thought about bringing back a nuclear program. They increased military spending and they started to develop new military technologies. However, they're still not really comparable to most states. One of the only things that weakens North Korea is the fact that China's military is not very strong. China needed help to pull off the four modernization. So they increased their exports and they created what was called SEZs, these special economic zones. And these were set up for foreign trade. One of the leaders of this open door policy is going to be the United States. Deng Xiaoping came to the United States and met with President Carter. Also, President Nixon went and traveled into China in the late 1970s. So the United States, you can see in this political cartoon, is holding the keys to China, which is definitely the case. As you know, everything in the United States is now made in China. The effects of all of the four modernizations is huge advancements economically. It did create a class struggle between the newly educated and those who were denied education during the Cultural Revolution. However, that generation is starting to die off, so we will not see that conflict very much anymore. Of course, there's going to be massive inflation, which is going to cause a slight gap between rich and poor. Still the case today. There's very, very rich and very, very poor in China. Pollution and deforestation. Pollution was completely ignored in the building of industry, and you can see that in Beijing with the smog and everything. And then, of course, they were overpopulated, so their goal was to create a one-child policy. The one-child policy is now being reversed because it was successful and that it did create a lower population. However, now that they have a lower population, those laborers are starting to demand more things like human rights and minimum wages. And so that's actually one of the reasons why a lot of American companies are coming back home. One of the political effects of the open door policy is the rise in desire for democracy and protection of human rights and better living conditions across the country. People started to ask for freedom of speech and started to ask and created protests as a result of wanting these human rights and new changes. In 1989, there was a protest happening in Tiananmen Square. Basically, the protesters, there were laws in the communist state about having public gatherings. While that's protected in the United States, that's something that's not allowed in communist China. Basically, the government there was an important figure who died, and so people came together in remembrance of the important figure, and it ended up turning into protest about human rights. It just so happens that there was a bunch of Western press in the state at the time because of a visit by Gorbachev. Gorbachev was going into China for a visit. And so there was Western press everywhere. Deng Xiaoping told the army to take all necessary measures, and hundreds were killed in Tiananmen Square, but the Chinese government said that no one was hurt. However, because the Western news groups were there, we know that that's not the case. 1911 to 1920 saw a Mexican Revolution or a Mexican Civil War. There was President Diaz created the idea of industrialization and modernization, but he completely ignored human rights. At first he was liberal, but then he totally became a dictator. He still held elections, but rigged the votes. He encouraged the building of factories, roads, industrialization, and commercialized farms. And there was a new proletariat, and of course, as a result, a new bourgeoisie. So that gap between the rich and the poor get bigger and bigger, so we're going to have a revolution. President Diaz actually tried to push out the U.S. from Mexico throughout this time by inviting the British and the German in. He wrote a new law that stated that you couldn't claim your land unless you had legal title. Well, 95% of Mexico's land was owned by 5% of the population. As a result of this, you get two guys named Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, who became like Robin Hood type figures for the poor. They would steal from the rich, give to the poor. Workers were abused, treated like slaves, murdered, all kinds of stuff. And debt started to pass from generation to generation. During the 1910 election, Diaz had the challenger jailed, and so that people could not actually vote for him. This created the revolution. Madero manages to get out of jail and creates a large army and defeated the Mexican Federal Army on May 21, 1911. Diaz signs a treaty with Madero, basically giving the presidency over to Madero. Now keep in mind, Madero was not elected. He was given the presidency as a result of the war. He then held an election where he won. Now this is great PR on Madero's part. Madero created a liberal democracy with U.S. support. He refused to make land reforms, and he was overthrown in 1913 and was killed. Alvarado manages to take control in 1915 and created a socialist land reforms by breaking up those old haciendas and giving land to the peasants. There was a constitution written in 1917 that still exists today in Mexico. It issued universal suffrage, which means women as well. There was a one-term president with a state-run education. The Catholic Church was still controlling education in Mexico until this 1917 constitution. He was going to end all foreign economic investment. Does not work well for Mexico, and as a result, we end up with NAFTA in 1994. And he does create workers' laws. It's impossible to put in place completely, and Cardenas, because the Mexican government needed money, he will nationalize the Mexican oil industry, which was a very socialist move, which obviously the United States did not necessarily like. Part 5 of 6.2 states that although conflict dominated much of the 20th century, many individuals and groups, including states, opposed this trend. Some individuals and groups, however, intensified the conflicts. Part C. Militaries and militarized states often responded to the proliferation of conflicts in ways that further intensified conflict, such as the promotion of military dictatorship in Chile, the U.S. promotion of New World Order after the Cold War, and the buildup of the military-industrial complex and arms trading. What is meant by the idea of a world order is basically the political state of affairs on a global scale. Okay? So previously, and especially up to World War II, most of the world's power was centralized in Europe. Europe was basically running the show. After World War II, the world became bipolar. You have the first world, which would be US and all of our friends, the second world, which was the Soviet Union and all of their friends, and then the third world states were states that were not involved in the war at all, who tried to stay out of the Cold War, which obviously did not help them. However, we have been misusing that term third world to mean poor countries. That's not actually a term that should be used anymore because the Cold War is over. The current world order is called unilateralism, which basically is where the U.S. is in a position of hard power dominance, with allies who follow our every lead. Most global tensions are against the U.S. dominance in this system. Any global tension that comes out through right now is a result of U.S. dominance in the New World Order. So the issue is, do we start creating more of a balance of power? Do we let go of some of our power? So for example, the recent stuff with President Obama and Israel and Iraq and Iran and all that kind of stuff and all those negotiations, well, the idea is that the United States maybe shouldn't necessarily be involved in all of those things. And one of the biggest issues with internally in the United States is that there's many people who feel that we shouldn't be involved in international issues. They want to go back to Washington's idea of isolationism. Challenges to this unilateral system is globalization of economics. The United States took a big hit in the 2008 recession because we were just as affected as other states, and in fact, we impacted other states. People grew angry at us. Another issue is China. China's coming out as a huge economic power. Could they possibly become a political power? Maybe. We're a little bit scared about their association with North Korea. But again, their military is still kind of weak, so I think we might be okay there. Nuclear weapons. As we get further and further into research on whether Pakistan has nuclear weapons, or whether Taliban itself or Al-Qaeda itself has nuclear weapons, or whether Iran has nuclear weapons, or North Korea, all of those things are going to threaten the fact that we're the ones who have the nukes, we're the ones who developed it, and we're the only ones who have used it. Now, it can be positive or negative. Terrorism, of course, is the largest threat to unilateralism. Terrorists are attempting to destroy the system and attempting to change the world order completely. And of course, the European Union. Now, the European Union's slow recovery from the 2008 recession has lessened that as a threat to unilateralism. The EU has not recovered like we have. We've done really well in the past 2 years. Our unemployment rates have plummeted. Our housing system is going back up. People are getting jobs again. Factories are reopening. There's so many good economic things that have happened in the United States in the past 2 years that in the EU has not had that success. They have not had the same success in economic recovery as we have had. You can look at Greece as an example of that. And the EU states are fighting about recovery systems. And so the EU is not as strong as it was 2 years ago or even 4 years ago. I want to make sure you understand what the military-industrial complex really is. Basically, it's a policy and monetary relationships which exist between legislatures, national armed forces, and the military-industrial base that supports them. So, for example, when the government contracts a certain company to build our tanks, that is an example of military-industrial complex. So, the largest example that I can give you is President Reagan. President Reagan really created this idea. He used a huge, massive amount of government spending on arms and on developing our military. One of the biggest things, a couple of threats under Reagan was the Iran-Contra affair. If you remember, Iran had the revolution and we had hostages. What ended up happening was Reagan was selling guns, we don't know. Somebody from the United States was selling arms to Iran during Hussein's invasion in 1980. So Iran was getting guns from us. Obviously, this is hugely controversial because we were very anti this fundamentalist Shiite movement in Iran that took American hostages. The money earned from the sales was then sent to Contras down in Nicaragua, and the Contras, if you remember, were trying to overthrow a socialist government. Whether any of that is true and whether any of that is very clear is still up in the air. Reagan eventually comes in and says, apparently I did do this, but I was unaware. Reagan blames the military blames Reagan. Another huge arms sale that Reagan was involved with was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is called the Star Wars program. And the Star Wars program was this idea that, I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh, was the idea that we could put basically almost like a protective shield over the United States, and that if a nuke or any missiles were sent to the U.S., that we could blow it up before it even got here. I remember seeing public service announcements about this on television when I was younger, and they used lasers, and there's actually a clip I'll show you of one of the commercials that was associated with the Star Wars program. We spent a huge amount of money on it, never needed it, because ultimately Reagan and Gorbachev will eventually end the Cold War anyway.